I want to start tonight by asking a question. So I want everybody to look at me and let me ask you this question. What is your one thing? Everybody's got a one thing. Everybody. Any human being that has ever lived has got a one thing. Okay? Every 7 billion people on the planet right now, that means there are 7 billion people who have their one thing. And so the question I'm asking to start off tonight is, what's your one thing? What is your one thing? Now, you say, well, how do I find out what my one thing is? Like, is there some kind of test that I can go through to find out what my one thing is? Well, let me ask you a couple questions, or let me give you a couple things to think about where you can find out what your one thing is, okay? The one thing you desire, the one thing you cannot live without. How do you spend your time? What do you spend your time on? What do you spend your resources on? Okay, if you have money, right? Or you have property, how do you use that property? How do you use the stuff that you have in your life? How do you use money? All these resources that you have. How do you use these resources? What do you spend your effort attempting to do? So when I ask you the question, what is your one thing? When you start trying to decide or determine what your one thing is, those are things you got to think about. Okay, what do I spend my time doing? Where do I give my effort? Where do my resources go? Where is my focus? Everybody has a one thing. So many people, for instance, it may be a relationship, right? A human relationship. That might be somebody's one thing, and so they spend their time and their effort and their resources on that relationship more than anything else because that relationship is their one thing. It's their one desire. It's their one thing they cannot live without. People think about it, well, it's the benefit that comes with making a lot of money. Right? It's all the fruit that comes from making a lot of money. And so their job is their one thing. And so they spend all of their time and all of their effort and all of their energy on their job because their job is their one thing. It's where they're going to find their identity. It's what they can't live without. And we can just go down a list of examples of people who, and what their one thing is. And so the question I want us to answer tonight, and we're going to look at David's one thing in a minute, but everybody has got to answer that question for themselves tonight. Every single person. What is my one thing? That doesn't mean, listen, you're going to have other things, but if you're talking about priority, right? If you're talking about what is the thing in my life that is so elevated and great that I cannot live without it, that is your one thing. And I want you to think about your one thing tonight. David has a one thing. One thing that he would give up everything else for. And after we read verses 4, 5, and 6, and we talk about them and study them, I pray that we leave here with the exact same one thing that David has. So Psalm 27, I'm going to read verses 4, 5, and 6. One thing I have asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. I want to break these verses down for us tonight and kind of walk through them and talk about them a little bit. First, let's talk about David's one thing. Okay, David's one thing. We're going to start in verse 4. And before we get into what the one thing is, I want you to understand this starts a new a new stanza in the psalm. Remember, it is the book of what? It is the book of Revelation. The book of what? Psalms. Plural, correct? Plural Psalms. We are in Psalm 27 because it is one psalm. So we have a book of songs. We're looking at the 27th song, singular. And in this song, there are stanzas or verses, right? Where you write a verse, you kind of focus on one thing, and then you write another verse or another stanza, and you focus on something else. We've already talked about the first stanza. It's verses 1, 2, and 3. Verse 4 starts a new stanza. And David is revealing that he does have a one thing. David has one thing in his life that matters more than anything else. In spite of any distraction he may have, in spite of any weakness that he may have, in spite of any disappointment that he may have, in spite of the enemies that David has dealt with, when it's all said and done, in spite of all of that, David has one single, solitary desire that rules everything else in his life. This desire is not just revealing itself in this one song. It has been the desire of David's life since he was young. David has experienced much loss in his life. He has lost friends. He has lost his position. He has lost family. He has lost possessions. And here's what's interesting. Look at everything I just said he lost. He lost his position. He lost his friends. He lost family. He lost his possessions. And yet David doesn't ask for the recovery of all those things when he's talking about his one thing. Now think about what humans would normally do. Human beings would normally think about the stuff they've lost and they go to God and start asking God, God, I want to recover that stuff. Give me the stuff back. Give me my position back, my friends back. What you're doing is you're basically saying, I want to use God so that God can get me this stuff back. There is a man who goes to our church who was put in prison for drug abuse. I believe he spent 6 years, I think 6 years, 3 years in prison. And then he was on probation after that, I think, for 3 or 4 more years. And he talks about a place as you exit the prison called the Bible Graveyard. And he said that to me, and I was like, what's the Bible Graveyard? And he said, here's what the Bible Graveyard is. It's all these men who get in prison. This was a men's prison, so I can't speak about a woman's prison. But all these men who go to prison, who lose everything. And in prison, they run to God. Right? They run to God in prison. They read their Bible in prison. They pray that God would get them out. They pray that God would restore their life. They pray all these things. And as they finally get freed, as they're walking out of the prison, the Bible Graveyard is this place over to the right where they take their Bible given to them in prison and they toss it off to the side. They don't need it anymore. God answered their prayer. Things are going to get restored to them. They're out of prison. Now we disregard God. David doesn't ask for the recovery of all the things. Not when he's talking about his one thing. That's not what he does. And look how earnestly he desires it. Look at verse 4. It says, I seek after it, and I ask for it. This is a pleading. In other words, this isn't David going, I got this one thing that I really like to have. This is David saying, listen, there is one thing I ask. There is one thing I seek above everything else in the world. One thing that I want to go after. He's earnestly pursuing it. And what is that one thing? Verse 4 says, to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. To dwell in the house of Yahweh forever. All the days of his life. Now, at this point in Israel's history, Israel has a house. Okay? This house is a temporary tent. They do not have a temple yet. Not when David's around. David's son Solomon builds the temple. So what they have is they have a tent of meeting. They have a tent that they would call the house of the Lord. So, and this was a specific place where they would go and worship God. It was, in fact, the place that was the center of worship. So I want you to understand this first. What David is saying is my one thing is all about worshiping the Lord. Okay? The one thing I ask, the one thing I seek, it has at its heart a desire to worship the Lord. But we have to understand that it's not just about the physical tent. It's not like David's going, you know what, I just really love this tent. I got to go to this tent. I got to hang out in this tent. Yes, that tent was special, and it was set up and ordained and decorated just like God wanted it to reveal certain things, some symbolic things. But David is not focused on the tent here. Do you know what would happen in that tent? They would move from place to place, and they would set up the tent. And they would get everything out that they were carrying, and they would get that tent perfectly decorated as God said. They would put the Ark of the Covenant and the altars and where they would make their sacrifices. They set it all up. And you know what would happen? The manifest presence of God. And when I say manifest presence, I'm talking about a tangible, you know it's happening. Remember when Israel leaves captivity in Egypt when they were slaves and they crossed the Red Sea? How did God manifest himself? During the day, it was a cloud. During the night, it was a pillar of fire. I think it was always fire with a cloud around it. During the day, the fire wasn't as bright. It looked more clouded. At night, the fire shone through. That was the manifest presence of God. Well, they would set up the tent of meeting, and that presence would go and actually dwell upon the tent. The manifest presence of God would show itself in the tent. So Yahweh would manifest himself here, and this is where people would go to have worship. So here's what I think David is saying. David understands God doesn't dwell in the tent. It's not like God just puts his whole presence in the tent. But what he's saying is he's using this language in a song, right? To say, listen, the one thing I want more than anything else in my life is I want to walk in intimate fellowship with the presence of God. More than anything else. I lost family, I lost friends, I lost position, I lost possessions. I'm not asking as a part of my one thing to recover all that. My one thing is I want to walk in intimacy with the presence of God. That's what I want. And he says two basic things to let us know that this is what he's talking about. Number one, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. Right? I want to dwell in the house of the Lord all my days so that I can gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. Now, I ask the question, what does it mean to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord? Because the Bible says no man can look at God face to face and survive. Because we're not holy, right? We're not, we have not been completely redeemed yet. Now, one day we'll be able to do that. But right now, in our flesh bodies, we can't see God in his fullness or we just drop dead. So, what does it mean to see or to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord? Well, here's what I think he means. Here's what I think the Bible means by this. It is the character and the attribute of God, the attributes of God. Who is God at his essence? I want as a Christian, and David is saying, I want as a follower of Yahweh, what I want to do is I want to walk in intimacy with God, and I want to know who he is. I want to be in the presence of his character and his attributes, his love, his grace, his mercy, his goodness, his faithfulness. All these things, we can just rattle them off over and over and over again. His all power. He wants to gaze at the beauty of this. Psalm 90 verse 17 says, let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us. The entire chapter of Psalm 90 is all about the character of God demonstrated to his people. So the whole chapter in Psalm 90 is all about the character of God and the attributes of God manifested on his people. And then they say at the end, oh, let the beauty of the Lord be upon us. See, the beauty of God is who he is in his essence. God's character. So David wants to dwell or gaze upon the presence and the reality of God. And then number 2, he says, I want to meditate upon it. Now, in the ESV, look at verse 4. In the ESV, it says, and to inquire in his temple. Probably a better translation of inquire is to meditate. The Hebrew word at its core it means to meditate. And so here's what I think David is saying. David is saying, listen, I want to be in the presence of God, in the reality of who he is. I want to gaze upon his beauty, but I just don't want to know things in my head. Right? Man, we got people coming to church all the time in America that learn a whole bunch of stuff about God. When I was little, I used to hear this all the time. If it doesn't go from here to here, then it doesn't matter what's up in your brain. It doesn't matter all the knowledge you have about God. You can have all the knowledge of who Jesus is and what Jesus did. You can know the Bible backwards and forwards and upside down. But if it has not moved from your head to your heart, then it doesn't matter what's in your head. I think David is saying, listen, this isn't just about me knowing about God or knowing the attributes of God or knowing the character of God mentally. I want to meditate upon who he is. I want to walk in complete worship and communion in intimacy with God. You see, David gets this. Guys, look at me. Look at me. David gets this because David has done this his whole life. What was David's job when he was little? When he was a young teenager? What was his job? He was a shepherd. Guess where shepherds spend a lot of their time? Out in the field. So guess what David would do out in the field with the sheep? Spend time with God. He would sing. He would pray. They say that some of the Psalms were probably written as a teenager and then recounted for us later. David doesn't just want to do religion with God. He wants to walk in communion with God. He wants to walk in intimacy with God. Now, I've already mentioned this, but let's say it again. I love that David wants the Lord more than he wants anything else. A lot of people want the Lord for what the Lord can give them, but not the Lord himself. Christian, listen to me. I don't care how old you are, listen. If you just want Jesus for what Jesus can give you and not Jesus himself, you don't get Jesus. You only get Jesus if you come to Jesus for him. I want you, Jesus. I want you, God. I want a relationship with you. I'm thankful for everything else that gets thrown in with it. For instance, if I said to you, pray this prayer and you can get saved and not go to hell. And you say, I want that. I want that no hell stuff. I'm down for that. So yeah, I'm going to raise my hand. I'm going to pray. I'm going to do whatever I got to do so I don't get the hell stuff. And I also like the heaven thing. You're just using Jesus to get something. You're not actually doing what David's doing. David's saying, I want God, not just what God can give me. I actually want God. There's a big difference between the two. And then look at the results of David's one thing. I'm going to go through these quickly here. David knows that being intimate with the Lord will bring great results. Great things do happen when we seek God's face. And David mentions 3 of them, but listen to me. All 3 are basically, he's saying the same thing 3 different ways. Okay? Again, this is poetry. This is music. It's like if I was, writing a poem to my wife and I said, you are like a sunflower. A sunflower does this. And you are like a daisy because a daisy does this. And you are like a tulip because a tulip does this. And I was saying basically the same thing, but I was using 3 different examples to say the same thing. That's what he's doing here. Babe, you are a sunflower and what did I say? Daisy and a tulip? Number 1, look at verse 5. He says, so when he seeks the Lord, when he desires to walk in intimacy with God, there are results that come as a result of that, as a response to that. Number 1, he will hide me in his shelter. So number 1 is he hides me. Now, When David was king, or even when David was the leader of the army, when they would camp for the night, they would actually have a pavilion. It was called the Royal Pavilion, and it would be in the center of the camp. So just imagine like all the warriors, right? So they all stop and they camp, and they put a pavilion up in the center of the camp, and that's where the king or the general or the leader stays. So the leader of the army stays there, and a group of soldiers actually circled the entire pavilion. The entire shelter was circled by soldiers. So think about what David is saying. David's like, listen, the Lord's going to hide me in his shelter, and he's going to surround me all the way around to protect me and keep me safe and defend me. David knows that intimacy with the presence of the Lord brings shelter from the worst enemies. Number 2, conceal me. He says, secondly, conceal me under the cover of his tent. If David was literally in the tent of meeting, listen to me now. If David was literally in the tent of meeting, the presence of Yahweh would be there. The presence of God would be in that tent. Nobody would mess with David there. Can you imagine if somebody tried to attack David while David was in the tent where the presence of God was like right there manifested? That would not go well. That would not go well. David is saying, God conceals me in his tent. He conceals me in the cover of his tent with his presence. Number 3, he says, the Lord will lift him up upon a rock. This is the imagery of being on a rock that the storm cannot destroy. Now, when you hear that, you should go, oh, didn't Jesus tell a story like that? Didn't Jesus tell a story about a wise man that builds his house upon a rock and a foolish man that builds his house upon the sand? And when the storm comes and the wave comes and the water rises, guess what happens to the house that was built on the sand? It devours and it falls apart and the house goes down. But if it's built on the rock, it stays firm and strong. Guess where Jesus got that language from? The book of Psalms. David says this over and over and over again. You are my rock, you are my rock, you are my rock. So Jesus comes along and says, let me tell you, give you an illustration about this rock. David is saying, listen, the Lord will lift me up and put me on a rock so the storm of life cannot destroy me. The enemy will not be able to wipe me out because I'm standing upon the firm rock. So, 3 different ways of saying the same thing. He's going to hide me in his shelter. He's going to conceal me in his tent. And he's going to put me up on a rock. All ways of saying, listen, when I am seeking first the one thing that I desire in my life, which is to walk in intimacy with God, I know that God gives me protection and salvation and deliverance. Notice, what does he seek first? He seeks first intimacy with the Lord. As a result of that comes this other stuff. He doesn't go looking for the other stuff and going, Lord, I don't really want to walk in intimacy with you, but can you really deliver me and give me salvation and help me out? It's not what he does. And then lastly, number 3, David's praise. This is amazing to me. Because David is so confident that this is what God does for him, that David is already making preparation for how he'll praise him. Think about this. I want you to think about this. David's going, okay, one thing I ask, that I walk in intimacy with the presence, the real, genuine, in communion with the presence of God. And I know that when I do that, the Lord is going to bless me. And he's going to bless me in a lot of different ways. He's going to protect me. He's going to deliver me. He's going to bring salvation. Listen to me. Listen, here's what he's saying. I know that this is going to happen so surely. I have such a guarantee that this is going to happen. I'm making preparation for how I'm going to praise him when it does. I'm already telling you how I'm going to praise him once he does come through for me. He has this confident expectation that God will do this. You know what we call that? Hope. A confident expectation that good is coming. That's hope. He's not saying, I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. I hope tomorrow the weather's good. He has a confident expectation. All right? This confident assurance that good is coming. Because I have sought first communion with God. And I am so sure that this is going to happen. I'm pre-making my plans for how I'm going to praise Him once He does it. And He just lists 3 things. Sacrifices, shouts, and songs. He says, listen, when God comes through for me, and I know He will, there's going to be a bunch of sacrifices I make to Him. And later on we find out that David really means this, because when the Ark of the Covenant gets taken by the Philistines and David finally gets it and he's bringing it back to Jerusalem properly, every 10 feet they sacrifice another animal. Like they would just walk 10 feet, sacrifice an animal. Go 10 more feet, sacrifice an animal. Go, he is saying, listen, sacrifice is going to be a part of my worship. And then he says this, and shouting is going to be a part of my worship. Let me tell you what I don't like. And I know everybody has different personalities, but let me tell you what I don't like. I don't like that the Bible talks about shouting and making joyful noise to the Lord all the time, and you can't get some Christians to open their mouth very well. Like they don't sing loud. They don't, their whole relationship with God is just this quiet thing. Well, the problem is that the Bible tells us over and over and over again, shout to the Lord. That doesn't mean you always shout, or there's a time not to shout. But it means there are times to shout. David says, listen, I know that God's going to come through for me, and so I'm making preparation in my mind for all the shouting I'm going to do once He does it. I know I'm going to be shouting. And I can't wait to sing all the songs, too. I can't wait for all the songs I'm going to sing about God once God delivers me. So here's what David is saying in these verses. Let me sum up for you. Here's what David is saying. David is saying, I have one thing in my life that I desire over everything else. Nothing else compares to this one desire. And that desire is to walk in communion and intimacy with the one true living God. Now I know as a result of that, He is going to be my light and my salvation and my strength. Which He already said in verse 1. God is going to be this for me. And when He is this for me, I know so confidently that He is going to be this for me, I'm already making preparation to praise Him. I'm already making preparations for sacrifices, for shouts, and for songs. So let's come back to the question. What's your one thing? Don't talk, listen. What is your one thing? What is the one thing you can put your hope in? What is the one thing that you're confident in? Let me bluntly say this. Please listen carefully. If your one thing is not the presence and the beauty of the Lord, then it is called idolatry. If there is anything in your life that is your one thing, and it's not to walk in intimacy with Jesus, then you have become an idolater. That is having a one thing that isn't what the one thing should be. The Bible calls it idolatry. And we can make idols out of everything. Human beings are really good at making idols out of everything. We're really good about making our one thing a bunch of stuff it shouldn't be. And if your one thing is not the presence and the beauty of the Lord, I'm here to let you know it cannot deliver you. And in the end, you will realize the foolishness of your choice. If you choose one thing, me and my mom were having this conversation yesterday. There have been so many people in our church, guys, that they come and they're kind of on the outskirts, and they come for a while and they talk the game of wanting Jesus, and they talk the game of wanting to walk with the Lord and wanting to get their life right, but they've never really made the one thing walking in the presence of God. And so what happens is they so easily make the one thing something else. And so often it's relationships with people who don't love Jesus. What they do is they'll disappear from church, and the reason why they disappear is because they have found a relationship, a human romantic relationship, and that becomes their one thing. And you know what ends up happening every time in those relationships? Those relationships fall and crumble. And they come back to church. You know what they say? I was so foolish and stupid. And then guess what happens? They come back to church. They want to do things right. They talk all the talk again. They say they want Jesus. And then they get in another relationship with somebody who doesn't love the Lord. And guess what happens? Bye-bye church. Bye-bye community. Bye-bye Jesus. I've got my one thing again, another romantic relationship. And it happens over and over. And no matter how many times they come to the end of themselves and realize how foolish it is, they do it over and over and over again. Do you know how that changes? Well, and whatever it may be. I mean, I'm just using the example of a human relationship. But I know people in our church that it's been money. I know people in the church that it's been jobs. I know people in our church that it has been following after earthly human teachers rather than Jesus. We have people that have left our church because they have so devoted themselves to an earthly teacher that they make an idol out of that person. That's happened as well. So I'm just trying to give illustrations here. But you know how you prevent all that from happening? Is you determine in your heart, like David, there is one thing I'm going to seek after. One thing that I cannot live without. And it's walking in intimacy with Jesus. And so if this person over here wants to have a relationship with me and they're not going to get in on my one thing, then they're not going to have a relationship with me. Because my one thing will push that out. And if money tries to get it, money's not bad. Relationship's not bad. But when it starts getting into your life and it starts and you're tempted to make it your one thing, you say to money, you know what? I'd rather have no money and have Jesus. Isn't that what Jesus said to the rich young ruler? When the rich young said, what do I got to have to do to have eternal life? And what did Jesus say? He said, sell everything you have. Jesus only said that to one person, and the reason why is because that person, his one thing was his money. And Jesus says, you can't have two one things. You can have one thing, and it's got to be me. So you know what? I'd rather have no money and have Jesus. And you can just apply that to anything. I'd rather have no human romantic relationship and have Jesus. No matter what it is, you pick it. And I'm telling you, if you put your confidence in it, you will be made to look a fool. Like, it's going to happen. I have been a pastor now, it'll be 18 years next month. And for 18 years, I have seen it happen over and over and over again. People who have been made to look the fool because they didn't make sure their one thing was Jesus. I'm telling you that tonight as a means of warning, but I'm also telling you that tonight as a means of encouragement. Tonight, just determine in your heart, my one thing's going to be Jesus. And I don't care what else happens in life. I can lose my whole family. I can lose everything. I can lose my job, my money, my family. I can lose everything. But if I got Jesus, I still have everything I need.
Amen. That's right.
Doesn't matter. Now, I don't want to lose my family. I love my family. But if I lose my family and have Jesus, I still got everything. Let me end with this. Remember our biblical math? Remember our biblical math? Remember? Jesus plus nothing equals what? Everything. Everything minus Jesus equals what? Nothing.